Hey students, this is part 4 of my American Identity series. We've already covered the Native Americans, we've covered immigrants, and we covered the African Americans. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to spend about 17 minutes on the women in American history. And so we're going to get started. We're going to start right at 1491. 1491, obviously there's no European women in the picture at this point, but the Native American women are playing a role in the history of America. And a lot of it has to do with what tribe they're in. When you study Native American women, each tribe, the women have different roles. You have some that have the traditional roles like we envision today of the homemaker and stuff like that. But other Native American tribes, you have what's called a matrilineal society, in which the women are making the decisions. The women are the community leaders. So when you study the different Native American tribes, whether it's the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Massasoit, the Pequot, the Powhatan, any of those, take a look at the role of women in that time period and see where they fall. We're going to talk about two main women, Native American women in our history, Pocahontas and Sacagawea, and obviously they had more prominent roles in the society at this point. But moving on, we're going to get to the 1500s, and when we talk about the 1500s, we're primarily looking at the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, the Europeans coming in. That we talked about this being the scramble for North America between the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. Not a lot with the French and the Dutch, but when you talk about the Spanish, you have Cortez coming in with his conquest of the Aztecs. And I'm sorry I'm going to butcher this name, but he forged a relationship with La Malinche. And she acted as his interpreter and would later go into a relationship with him. And she is actually going to contribute to the fall of the Aztec Empire and help Cortez through that process. Any other women? There's, as far as European women, there is Virginia Dare. She is the first British citizen born in North America. She's actually born in the colony of Roanoke, but we don't know what happened to her. But that is one name that you could throw out there. Going into the 1607 to 1763 time period, really where you're going to find women is in the New England region. That's because you had the Pilgrims come in 1620, and then you had the Puritans come in 1630. And with that migration, they're coming over as families. You can go back to 1607, and you can talk about the founding of Jamestown, but it's not going to be until about 1609 or a little bit later when John Rolfe comes in, and he does marry Pocahontas, and she plays a key role in helping maintain the peace between the Jamestown settlers and the Powhatan Indian tribes. She's eventually going to go back to England with John Rolfe, where she will eventually die there. But that's one person. But when we go up to the New England region and we talk about the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who you really need to know is Anne Hutchinson, and the fact that she was banished from Massachusetts, and then went on to, I think she had like 7 or 8 kids, and she was actually ended up being killed by the Native Americans. But she got banished due to the fact that she was holding Bible studies in her home, teaching the Bible to men, which was very frowned upon in the Puritan lifestyle. We know the Puritans were a very homogeneous society, and if you weren't going to fall in line with them, you weren't going to be part of their society. So she was exiled and banished from the community. The other thing you need to know during this time period is probably the Salem witch trials. That happened in 1692. But other than that, when we're talking about women, that's who we're looking at for this time period. We're really going to jump now to the time period between 1763 and 1776. This is following the French Indian War. The proclamation line is in place. And what we're entering into the 1760s, I call that the age of protest. And you're going to see the rise of the Daughters of the Revolution. With all the different taxes, the tea acts, the sugar tax, the stamp act, all those women do get involved in the protest. You see the rise of the Daughters of Liberty. They organize boycotts, start making their own supplies so they don't have to rely on English-made goods, so they can actually do the boycott. That's going to lead us into the American Revolution. And when we get to the American Revolution, obviously starts in 1775, But with the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, we get our first introduction, honestly, to Abigail Adams, when she, writes to her husband John Adams as they're drafting the Declaration of Independence to remember the ladies. I tell people a lot of times that women might not have had a voice in society, but women definitely had a voice in the home. And I think you heard a lot of the men, were hearing what the women were thinking during this time. And I think Abigail Adams is an excellent example of that. Going into the American Revolution, we had women who actually fought in the battle. We talked about Molly Pitcher at the Battle of Monmouth, who actually helped win the war, helped win that battle. And then we're going to see the establishment of Republican motherhood during this time period as the Constitution is being created. And this idea that it's the woman's role in the home to teach civic duty to her children and what it means to be a good citizen in America at this time. This is going to lead us into the 1800s to the 1840s. We're going to see a shift from Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity. The idea that the women's job is at home, and that's a very important job. Not just to maintain the home, but to maintain the family and all that comes along with it. Educating their children in the workings of the American system and such. During this time, we're going to see the Second Great Awakening. With the Second Great Awakening, we see a rise in the Reform movement, and women were very involved in the Reform movement. They were fighting for suffrage on their own behalf, but they were also part of the abolition movement, the temperance movement, the prison reform movement, the mental illness reform movement. We're talking about people like Dorothea Dix, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. All these ladies are part of the reform movement during this time. 1830s, I wanted to throw that out there because during the 1830s we see women go to work in the Lowell system, where young girls and women are working in the Lowell factories, the textile mills, and stuff like that. So we see women going to work outside the home during the 1830s. The 1848 is a big year for women. The Seneca Falls Convention, led by people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This is the first organized women's right, convention, where they put together their Declaration of Sentiments and get the support of others coming behind them to really push this idea of equality and women's suffrage. The next thing I want to talk about, going to 1840 to 1865. Now, what we're going to find here is this is going to be the rise of manifest destiny. And what I want you to remember is as the country moves west, women's independence grows. And this is due just basically for necessity during this time period. As families move west, women just aren't sitting at home, taking care of the home. They're taking care of the business of the family, whether it's farming or they help build the homes or help clear the fields. They get more independence and have more voice in communities as well, because the communities' population numbers are low. So women get involved in the politics very early. And this is going to lead to, during the Civil War, you see women get involved in the war. You have some women, there are stories of women who dressed as men and actually fought in the war. But women primarily served as nurses during the war. Clara Barton is the perfect example and the beginning of the Red Cross. So we're seeing that women are starting to take a more, prominent role in the community. They've always been involved, but now they're moving more to the front of the community, where they're being seen more in their service to others. 1865 to 1900. This is where we see the settlement houses towards the end of the 19th century, where and the growth of women in industry. We're going to see more women working in industry this time. You see some of the muckraking journalists start to come out. I'm trying to think. Jane Hull in the settlement house, she gets her start during this time. And really, I'm just going to say it out there. The biggest thing that happens during this time, let's give it a big round of applause. 1869, the first state in the Union to give women the right to vote will be Wyoming. Much sooner than passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So we are moving towards that full suffrage in our country. 1900s to 1920s, the Gilded Age, you have the rise of the muckraking journalist. I mentioned that before in the previous time period, but you're going to find that here. Ida Tarbell and her expose on Standard Oil. Ida Wells is another one. So you're going to see a lot of this come up. The progressive movement gets started this time. Jane Addams and her settlement houses take rise. And what they're doing is they're teaching women to be better citizens, teaching them to be employable during this time period. And also during the 1920s, you see the rise of the independence of women. You see the flapper generation come out, where they're cutting their hair, and while their hair gets shorter, so do their skirts. So women are starting to express themselves much more in the 1920s. Going into the 1930s, an interesting fact about the 1930s during the Depression is women were actually more employable than men during this time. You see a lot more women getting jobs than than you would expect the men to get. So, but during the 1930s, it was, everyone was suffering during the Depression, and it was whoever could get a job, we take the job. And so a lot of the times it was the woman who could get the job. When we go into the 1940s, we get to World War I. And this is where we see the rise of Rosie the Riveter and women stepping into the role of men in the factories and showing that they absolutely could do the same work as men in building the tools necessary for war. Now I want to backtrack a little bit. I should have mentioned that in 1914 to 1918, women also served in the worked in the factories. But in all honesty, their workload was only for about a year or so, because we only went into World War II in 1917. So women didn't spend as much time in the factories like they did during World War II. World War II, as soon as we declared war, FDR was ready to mobilize. And the men went off to fight, and the women immediately went into the factories and they went to work. Once the war was over, though, women's contribution kind of changes. We see I'd say roughly about 80% of the women return to the home, which can explain why in 1945 we see the beginning of the baby boom. The baby boom is going to last until they usually use a year about 1961. So they're going to be quite busy with that. 1950s, we're seeing a return to normalcy, basically back to the way things were before the wars. But what we see is, instead of a return to normalcy, we're moving into this idea of conformity. And but at the same time, we're seeing that the glass ceiling, while we've made a lot of progress as far as women go, as far as jobs, and we have a lot more women in the workforce during this time, that glass ceiling still hasn't been broken. Women are still expected to be at home, and most women are involved in jobs, secretarial, teaching. You don't see a lot of movement towards the corporate world yet. It's going to be probably another 10 to 15 years before we actually see that. The 1960s that's going to be a huge move for women. We're going to see Betty Friedman actually challenge the role of women in both the workplace and the home. And the question is, why can't they do both? And so the women's rights movement really gets started in the late 1960s, going into the 1970s. And in the 1970s, honestly, we can, one big thing that happens during this time is the passage of Title IX, allowing women the same educational, athletic, financial support that men get in our education system and stuff. And I guess you can kind of say at that point the glass ceiling is starting to break. We go back to 1982. We see the first woman Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, is sworn into the Supreme Court. We see the first woman astronaut at this time, Sally Ride. And we see a rise in women politicians during this time as well. With regards to the executive branch of our government, women still have not made it to the top echelon of that. I mean, we've had several candidates going all the way back, and oh my gosh, I can't remember her name. She was Walter Mondale's running mate in 1980. Oh gosh, I can't remember her name. But then we actually see presidential candidates. We saw two this last election cycle with Hillary Clinton and Carly Fiorina. But while we haven't seen women rise up to the office of president, we have seen them in very powerful positions. Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State is the perfect example. So you can see the movement of women over time, and we're still making a lot of progress, and we're still making gains towards where we need to be. But that's kind of a quick look at women in American history. As always, if there's things that I missed or things that you don't understand, use this as a study guide and break it down and study what you need to. But if everything else sounds familiar, then go back and watch the Native American or the African American review and see if those help you out. Otherwise, I'm going to thank you for watching and go ahead and cut this off, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.